Well, here we are again. This is the second catch-up video of the bits and pieces I didn't get to this morning in our session. We've looked, therefore, at building upwards in routines and how we take one structure or grammatical item and we follow it all the way through, building and building and building on foundations that have been laid before. And now we're going to look a little bit more at building outwards, how we take a structure and explore it through different routines rather than in the same routine. So it's worth thinking for any language, for whichever language we teach, what are the key structures for that language? Which structures, if pupils knew them and knew them really, really well, would help them more than any other, and start with those. You might think of them as high frequency structures perhaps, or just foundational, which allow you to explore in greater depth or to a greater extent. So I've put down a few here and we talked about these this morning. Est-ce que je peux, il faut, or tu dois. You can sort of interchange between them, or you can use one and then start using the other one. Est-ce qu'il faut, so the question form of that. Il ne faut pas, voulez-vous, or veux-tu, to ask someone to do something, and then the negative form, ne verbe pas. In Spanish, you may well want to use equivalent expressions, or some of these are different, of course. Puedo, or se puede, asking if I can do something. Tienes que, or hay que, tengo que, or tenemos que. No plus subjunctive as a negative imperative is very, very useful. And infinitive constructions, especially those two. So if we take infinitive constructions, I'm thinking of things such as acabar de plus infinitive, or tengo que plus infinitive, even though we've always also got that further up the list. Expressions where pupils will use infinitives a lot, I think in Spanish has a particular importance. Yes, it is important in French, but with Spanish, thinking about the subjunctive. So you have your ar verbs and your and ir verbs. And for those who are not Hispanists, just to say that the present tense endings are fairly straightforward, but in the subjunctive, the ar endings and then the and ir endings swap. Now, unless you have a clear sense of the infinitive, it can be tricky for pupils to know when it's swapped and when it hasn't. When is it present indicative and when is it present subjunctive? And not pick up on the fact that this no with the subjunctive is an instruction, a negative one, and that when it's in the indicative, that obviously the endings match more closely the infinitive ending. So hablar, and then hablo, that's okay, hablas, you. Okay, so hablar, hablas. But in the if you take an verb like comer, como, comes, hablas, comes. But they as and es endings which match the infinitive. Hablas, hablar, comes, comer. If you swap those endings over, so instead of hablas, you have hables, and instead of comes, you have comas. That's difficult for the average pupil to notice, and not just the average pupil. Whatever that is. So it's really, really important, I think, in Spanish for them to have a very deep sense of what the infinitive of any verb is. It may not be the first way I'll present a verb, but at some point they need that. And there are lots of expressions you could use. So we're thinking of things like me toca a mí hablar y te toca a ti dibujar, or me toca a mí hacer la pregunta y te toca a ti contestar. Anything like that, which helps to helps pupils to internalize really deeply how these end. It will make your present indicative and present subjunctive endings much easier to get across, so that they recognize which voice is being used. Okay, which situations could you apply these to? Now, that's an exercise that if we'd had time, I'd have set you off on, but this might be a good moment to pause the video and just have a think of these expressions and any other expressions you've come up with, structures I meant, that you consider to be key in the language you teach. Which situations and how many situations could you apply them to? So maybe pause now, have a think about that, make a list, and then perhaps come back and have a few answers. So this is the table that I showed you in the session this morning. We were pushing it for time at the end, so I went through it a bit quickly. There's not a great deal more to say apart from the fact that the more situations in which you use a particular structure, the better pupils will understand what that structure means, the more they'll realize which are the variable points in the sentence. And it tends to avoid pupils saying things like est-ce que je peux un stylo, where they mean est-ce que je peux emprunter un stylo. For some reason, that second verb often gets missed out. And if they only have it in terms of can I have something, then they'll use avoir in every situation. Est-ce que je peux avoir, m'asseoir, and things like that. So the more situations you can include a structure in, the more deeply they will sense the meaning, they'll get the meaning, and the more fluent they'll become with it. So I've got it there in the team competition. Est-ce que je peux avoir un point? Incidentally, at the moment, I'm gradually writing up my team competition and all of its stages that will go on the blog very soon. And you'll see how that works in both French and Spanish. So, est-ce que je peux avoir un point? In the homework setting situation, est-ce que je peux avoir une meilleure explication? I referred to that when I was talking about the lateness routine this morning, and how that then develops, and we get to voulez-vous or veux-tu nous expliquer pourquoi tu es en retard? That's because it started here. Est-ce que je peux avoir une meilleure explication? And then in lots of general classroom language, which we'll come back to in a little bit. Est-ce que je peux m'asseoir? Est-ce que je peux enlever ma veste? Est-ce que je peux aller aux toilettes? Est-ce que je peux aller à mon cours de musique? Est-ce que je peux jouer à Jacadi? When they do that, that's often my opportunity to introduce est-ce que nous pouvons, or est-ce que la classe peut. Otherwise, again, they tend to say est-ce que la classe je peux, or est-ce que je peux la classe. Yeah. Est-ce que je peux avoir un stylo? Est-ce que je peux poser une question? So est-ce que je peux, I would say, is a key expression to get across as many situations as you can. Il faut and tu dois. One of my first opportunities to use this is within the homework setting routine or when I'm setting up activities. Il faut parler avec un partenaire, or il faut faire les gestes. Et l'autre personne, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire? Il faut dire le vocabulaire, or something like that. Okay, so le deuxième verbe est à l'infinitif. Is a very useful mantra here. So in the lateness routine, we have it as il ne faut pas arriver en retard, il faut arriver à l'heure, and then a much more advanced version, il faut que tu arrives à l'heure. That's one of the first opportunities they have for encountering the subjunctive. In a team competition, when I've cheated and put a point in the wrong pot and pretend I haven't noticed, they notice. Monsieur Stubbs, vous trichez, ne trichez pas. Il faut enlever un point à groupe 1 et le mettre dans le verre de groupe 2. I use the little glasses for it. So, forfeit routine. Tu as parlé en anglais. Tu dois avoir un gage is the first, sorry, that's the second step. The first step is tu as parlé en anglais, ne parle pas en anglais. And then it leads from there on to tu dois avoir un gage. And a later step, il ne faut pas parler en anglais. Pourtant, tu as parlé en anglais. Alors, tu dois avoir un gage. Okay. And in the homework setting, il faut, my instructions, and then the question they will have, both in the homework and in lessons for clarifying instructions. Est-ce qu'il faut copier ça? Est-ce qu'il faut, and so on. Now, voulez-vous and veux-tu is something I meant to mention this morning that slipped from my memory under the pressure of time, I think. Come back to that in a sec. So, veux-tu and voulez-vous. Voulez-vous is where they meet it first, and it's with voulez-vous répéter, s'il vous plaît. I don't usually teach them just répéter, s'il vous plaît, because it's hard to get them off it. So, voulez-vous répéter is good, and then I can swap the répéter for other verbs that when they're asking me to do something. Voulez-vous répéter ce que vous avez dit? Is the development of that. We mentioned earlier, est-ce que je peux avoir une meilleure explication? The next step for that one is this expression here for homework setting. Voulez-vous mieux nous expliquer l'activité? So in the team competition, it starts with est-ce que je peux avoir un point? And from there, est-ce que nous pouvons avoir un point for the group that they're in? And then from there to voulez-vous, to me, voulez-vous nous donner un point, s'il vous plaît? And usually what I'll do is I will withhold giving points in my team competition, apparently accidentally. Sometimes it's real, but to trigger that need to ask me. And if I want to go from one stage to another, from the est-ce que nous pouvons avoir un point to voulez-vous nous donner un point, I just jump in with aujourd'hui c'est différent and give them the next phrase. And then there's this one for the lateness routine. Voulez-vous nous expliquer pourquoi tu es en retard? Now, the bit I omitted to mention this morning was a good few years ago now, probably getting on for about 20 odd years ago. James came into our school to give us a day of observations and feedback and input, and it was wonderful, as always. And he'd seen, when he came into my lesson, he saw me using this. Voulez-vous mieux nous expliquer l'activité? And he said to me afterwards that you are just this step away from using the subjunctive. And this was with, from memory, I think it was a year 9 class. I hadn't thought about that. Well, it got me thinking about it. And in the end, I ended up having a capital V stuck to the wall. And down one arm of the V was voulez, and then the other one was vous. And then I had a flash symbol, and in it had written que. And then I had a list of je verbs in the subjunctive and a list of nous verbs in the subjunctive, of verbs that we would naturally use in the classroom. So, voulez-vous que j'écrive ça? Voulez-vous que je lise le texte? And voulez-vous que nous copions ça? And things like that. And the mimes we used for it were voulez-vous que nous copions ça? And it was surprisingly easy to set that up with a class, especially as they'd already had things like il faut copier, or est-ce qu'il faut copier, or est-ce qu'il faut écrire. This was now another step on. So that's something worth playing with once you've got all of this sort of thing up and running with a class. It's very interesting to try it. And then ne pas, hugely important, very easy in Spanish. Of course, with the instructions, then it makes it subjunctive. So we've got in the lateness routine, il ne faut pas arriver en retard. In the forfeit routine, ne parle pas en anglais. And il ne faut pas parler en anglais. In the homework setting, je n'ai pas très bien compris. And then in the general classroom language, je ne sais pas, on ne voit pas, ne touche pas, ne triche pas, ne regarde pas. It's very, very useful as a structure, and it really helps especially with things like je ne sais pas, where you've got a person of the verb there as well, and on ne voit pas. I use that for when the visualizer times out and the screen goes blank, and I haven't always noticed if I've got my back to it. It has happened in some other subjects where a class that I've taught, could be in science or something, they're also using a visualizer or something where the screen goes blank or the projector turns off, or the teacher stands in front of the screen and they can't see, and suddenly, all of a sudden, they'll scream, "On ne voit pas," or in Spanish, "no se ve." The teacher, who's got no idea what's going on, is quite surprised by this. That's when you know they've taken it in. So there we are. So this is something we didn't get a chance to discuss, but have a think about this. What difference does it make to have similar language running across more than one routine? Okay, what difference does it make to have similar language running across more than one routine? You might want to pause the video here and have a little think about that. So here goes with some answers, basically. What difference does it make to have similar language running across more than one routine? It crops up more often. And because it's a routine, it will happen regularly, frequently, meaningfully, just because we're in a classroom. Now, when people talk about the word routine, they often mean different things. Maybe I should discuss this right at the beginning of the morning, but teachers talk about their routines. And by that, they mean things like, well, when the children come in and they stand behind their chairs and they put their bags under the table and they wait. Or their routine might be when they sit down, they get their books out and they put them on their desks and they get their pencil case out and then they're ready. That's the first thing you do. Before anyone asks you to do it, you do it. I do the opposite, actually. I want them to sit down and have nothing on their desks because I want them to be looking up and looking at me and listening, and I can see that they're listening and there's no temptation to fiddle with anything. Or it might be that, when books are given out, there's someone from the front row who comes and takes a quarter of the books, someone else comes, takes another quarter, and so on, and they give the books out. That's not what I mean by routines. They are routines, they're very important routines, but that's not what I mean in all of this, which is why I started to call them language interaction routines, just to make the distinction. So we're talking about things that crop up just by virtue of being in a classroom. So I will need to set homework. I will need to collect in homework. I'll need to comment on it. Someone will sneeze because they do. What do we say when someone sneezes and how do they respond? Someone will speak in English when I don't want them to. How do we respond to that? Someone will arrive late. What do we do about that? What do they say in response? That's the sort of thing I mean. And having the similar language running across more than one routine simply means really that they will internalize that language and it becomes automatic and instinctive. And it means that when they find that language in other contexts and other situations, they're much more likely to be able to adapt endings, to substitute the right verbs or substitute the right part of the sentence, because they've got that framework, that structure well in. Now, what impact does this have on planning? Well, quite simply, we often have to be more than one lesson ahead. It's well worth taking some time before the start of a half term just to have the whole unit for a particular year group in your head, know where this is heading. But also to have an overview of the whole year. And if you can get that down onto one sheet of A4, all the better. And by that, I don't mean the contents page of the textbook. And in some schools, that's pretty much their scheme of work. I really don't mean that. I think you need to have a clear idea of where things are going linguistically. Yes, knowing about topics. Yes, knowing when telling the time is coming up or, things like that. But also, where are things going grammatically? And then working backwards, thinking, okay, if next term I need to be teaching telling the time, then in this term, I want to put that into my routines. If in 2 terms' time, they need to be able to use the perfect tense and use the 2 different auxiliaries, they need to know agreements, they need to know about regular and irregular past participles, and the best thing we can do is break that down and pull it back, pull it forwards in the year, and not come to that point where they've got to learn so much very quickly, because that's where you end up in the situation, a very deductive approach, where children are having to process rules very quickly while they're trying to say something, and they give up because it's too much strain. Or they'll write things down and then try and memorize them rather than being able to work it out while they're talking and while they're in conversation. The difference by the end of year 11, if that's what they've done all the way through, is huge. Whereas if from the beginning of year 7, they've learnt to think on their feet and work things out as they go along, then multiply that by 5 years. By the end of year 11, they really are in a much, much better place. And you get something much more akin to truly spontaneous speaking, rather than spontaneous speaking being, I've learned all of these questions, I've learned all of these answers, I just didn't know which question was coming next. That's not really spontaneous speaking. Being able to work it out as you go along. So we talked about, is the game worth the candle? Or as the expression more often is, the game is not worth the candle. So thinking about, how much would it cost to buy this candle? How much can you win from this game? I'm not going to win as much as it costs to buy the candle. It's not worth the candle. That's where it comes from. So with all of this input, all of this investment, all of this time, all of this keeping track of where it goes with each classes and building up and building outwards, is the game worth the candle? Well, I'm absolutely convinced that it is. So this is my 25th year of teaching. And of course, someone else with 25 years experience could say, well, I've never taught that way. I don't want to teach that way. And my classes are doing fine. So, what I say cancels out what you say. Well, we've got to look at the principles. We've got to look at whether, if you teach this way, if you plan out these routines, if you develop this instinctiveness, but you've also got the reflectiveness where you can work out where you're going, whether you're getting it right, whether you're getting it wrong, how you improve it, how you correct it. The difference is really quite significant. I always notice it whenever I go to a new school where the pupils have not been taught with routines. Their performance in speaking is very different. Now, it's true that you can get to a level of fluency, a very good level of fluency, without ever having done any routines in your life. But I think the difference is that the pupils who tend to do best without this tend to be the pupils who are very strong at most things. But of course, we've got to reach everybody. We've got to reach those in the middle of the class. We've got to reach the weakest ones. And some of them won't be able to process rules consciously, but they will be able to develop a feel for the language. I often think it's worth asking someone who's not a linguist, what's the difference between I'm going to and I will in the future tense in English? There's no good asking a linguist. There's no good asking someone who's taught a bit of English as a foreign language, because it will skew the results. But if you take someone who doesn't speak another language and you say, I will go out on Saturday, and I'm going to go out on Saturday, what's the difference? And see if you can get them to tell you. And very often, they won't get it right. Very often, their explanation isn't actually true. It isn't accurate. And what that tells us is that if they are able to use this item of grammar accurately and fluently in their normal conversation, which a native speaker does, then actually knowing the rule is slightly less important than some language teachers would have us believe. So some would say you only know the grammatical item when you can explain the rule. You only know the grammatical item when I can give you an exercise, a transformation exercise, and you can get it all right. I understand where that thinking comes from. But it's not true to say that that's the only way of knowing an item of grammar. And I think for some of our weaker pupils who find it's just too much of an overload to process all of these rules before they can get a sentence out, speaking becomes a very stressful thing. And routines for my money are certainly the way to go. So that's my thoughts on that little issue. So that's where we started. What are you aiming to achieve as a languages teacher? And the aim that I gave you, that I explained to you, my own aim is this: to teach pupils in such a way, so the manner of the teaching is important, that they become confident communicators in a foreign language based on an instinctive yet reflective knowledge of how the language works. Building up this instinctiveness, but also bringing up the reflectiveness. They're not parroting language. They're thinking about it. They know which bits to change. They know how to change them. That's what I'm trying to do. So it's now over to you, really, to consider whether the approach that I've explained today, whether that achieves that. Well, I'm going to take a little bit more time in this video just to explain a few ways in which we can manage all of this in a practical way. And it can be quite difficult, actually, just trying to keep track across classes. So I'm going to pause the video just for a moment while I get my things together, and then I'll show you one of the ways that I found most useful in recent years for just keeping track, especially where all of the classes that you're teaching are new to you. Okay, I've got some things in place now. So this is one way that you can do this, a way of keeping track of things across classes. This is from a class I had a few years ago where I had all of year 7. So there were 6 year 7 classes. And I was beginning to find it difficult as the class walked in to remember what I'd done with this class, and had I done this? Oh no, that was with another class. And some routines were breaking down because I couldn't keep track, having taught it the same lesson pretty much 6 times, whether this had come up with this class or that had come up with that class. And anyway, this is what I did. So I've got all of the classes across the top and all of the phrases that I anticipated using in that half term. So the first half term, September, October, and I just taught the lesson. I mean, there would be certain expressions and phrases and things that I knew I was definitely going to need, but other things sort of happened. And to embed these phrases, I used these bubble cards that I'll show you in a second. And as they were needed, these bubble cards would go on the wall. And then at the end of the lesson, as the pupils left, as the last pupil went out of the room, all I needed to do was grab this, which was stuck on the wall behind my desk, and just go down the list and go tick, 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 and just tick the things I'd used. The cards came off the wall, went on the floor, ready for the next class, and I could just teach the next class. The same thing happened again. At the end of the lesson, tick, 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 and I could see where it was, without necessarily trying to do the same thing in every class. You know, some things would be, but other things were more spontaneous. Now, after 3 or 4 weeks, then I could look over the whole thing and say, well, where are there gaps? You know, so what have we got here? I mean, this was towards the end of the half term by this stage, where most of the things are filled in, and I'd used Espera with one class, but I hadn't with any of the others. And when I say used it, I mean used it where they were using it, they were joining in with it, it became something that they were using. So only one class had got it, and that's the sort of thing where I can forget which of the 6 classes it was. But after 3 or 4 weeks, I can think, okay, there's a gap. Now I am going to make sure that with the other classes, I get that in as well. And then I can tick it off and I know I'm there. So this all looks fairly consistent. It wasn't all the way through the half term. You know, it's after 3 or 4 weeks that I would go and fill in those gaps. And of course, if there's anything on here that I don't have need to use in that first half term, it's no problem. I use it in the second half term. But basically, by the time I get to the end of the year, I would want to be using all of these. And there's lots and lots of expressions there that can be used. So that's a very helpful way, very easy way of just keeping track without it being any more work than that. And then what I would do is just before the next class comes in, I would have a look at their column just to refresh my memory that, ah, yes, I've done that with them, haven't done that, that's okay. And then I'm able to go. No good doing it at the beginning of the day, because by the time I get to their lesson, I'll have forgotten it again. But just before they come in and be ready in that way. Okay, so that's something that you might want to do. I use that with most of my classes. Okay, so last couple of bits. I mentioned this morning a lesson menu, and I didn't quite have time to go into that. So let's just look at that very briefly. So the lesson menu, this came from where in some schools, as we discussed this morning, they're very strong on everyone has to go through their objectives for the class at the beginning. Now, I don't do that, because I teach my lesson in the target language, and at that stage, pupils don't have enough language to understand those objectives. And even if they did, I don't think, even if they understood the language, they wouldn't understand the point of the objectives. So my objective might be that by the end of this lesson, yes, I want pupils to be able to say 6 activities in the perfect tense using regular verbs. But also I want them to be able to speculate in the target language on, I don't know, the meanings of non-cognate words. Now, they wouldn't know why that was valuable or why that was important. And so even though that's an important objective from my perspective, they're not going to understand it. And I could explain it all to them, but it's just going to take so long that the lesson's gone. And I think it's best just to get on with the lesson and to make sure they learn whatever it is I teach them. Of course, I do need to have objectives, and they need to be specific. And objectives are not, the lesson will be about holidays. That's not a learning objective or a teaching objective. Whereas if I was to say by the end of this lesson, pupils should be able to ... then that's more like it. Anyway, this is a way of sort of getting around that. Sometimes, I'm afraid, in schools where they insist that you explain your objectives, they're not always very strong on what a good objective actually is, and it tends to be about content, so you might be able to get away with this. Basically, on the wall, I have, I'll share this with you, it'll be a little bit too big for my visualizer, unfortunately. But on the wall, I have d'abord, ensuite, and then underneath that, finalement. Okay, d'abord, ensuite, finalement. And then I've got it on a different color here because this has just come off the printer, but I would cut this off. On va, and this would go to the right of these discourse markers. Okay, so d'abord, ensuite, finalement, on va. And also on the same wall would be quite a lot of fairly thin pieces of cards, narrow pieces of cards with infinitives. So on va écrire, on va dessiner, on va chanter, on va lire, on va deviner, on va répondre à des questions, on va whatever else you can think of. On va parler, on va pratiquer, on va apprendre. And you don't worry about whether they're regular or irregular, they just all go in. And then I would pick 3 of these and stick them elsewhere on the wall and ask the class, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui? D'abord, on va parler, ensuite on va écrire et finalement on va chanter. Ou d'abord on va chanter, et ensuite on va écrire, and so on. And they've got to speculate on what the order might be. Okay, so I've got my class in their groups. I usually have 4 teams in a class. And they discuss with themselves, qu'est-ce que tu penses? Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui? They talk to each other in pairs. And while they're doing that, I just write down on a post-it note the order of the 3 verbs, okay, of the 3 activities. And I keep that hidden. And then I'll go to the first group And the whole class will shout together, Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce que tu penses? And then someone puts their hand up and says, D'abord, on va chanter, ensuite on va écrire, et finalement on va, I've come up with the third one, wasn't I? Whatever it was. And I look at my post-it and I confirm whether they're right or not. I don't say how many they've got right, I just say, oui, c'est bon, non, c'est pas bon. Now, I also have on my table under the visualizer 7 points, little points cards. I usually use little thumbs up cards. And I've got 7 of them. I put them on the table. Now, if they're wrong, I take one of those points away and I put it in my pocket. So now we're playing for 6. And I'll go to another team. And they ask the team, Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce que tu penses? And someone says, d'abord on va écrire, ensuite on va parler, et finalement on va chanter. And if they're wrong, then I take another point and put it in my pocket. And we go to the next script. And we keep going until someone gets it right. And by the end, they might be playing for 1 point or something. And then that goes in their team's pot. But they've been speculating on what's going to happen in the lesson and using this future tense verb. And every time they tell me what they think it is, the order it is, I take that narrow verb and I put it next to d'abord. So I've got d'abord, ensuite, finalement, on va, and then we put the verb there and put it in the order so it's all clear and visual. Now, as the lesson continues, it is a simple matter as you finish each activity to take it off. So maybe you say d'abord on va chanter. So we've sung. So take that off and go and stick it on the back wall. And there I've got a big poster which says on a. So on a chanté. And no, unfortunately, I don't have the visual to show you. I know, I've got another idea. Piece of paper. I will use my visualizer and I will show you how you make it and do it all at the same time. How about that? Right, share screen, visualizer. There we are. Okay, so I'm going to pen. So just supposing we have got okay, so d'abord on va chanter. So I take this off the wall and I go to the back of the classroom, and when I put it up, I fold this over because there on the other side I've got that. Okay, and now it says on a chanté. And then I go on to the next activity, which would be, say the next activity was on va parler. So I've got a separate piece of card stuck on the wall. Well, actually, let's start a bit further along. Parler. Okay, and when I finish that activity, I take it off the wall. I go to the back of the room because the pass is behind you. Et on a parlé. Now that works very well, but it gets a little bit more exciting still. Whoops. If the next one is écrire, now you might be ahead of me now. Écrire is an irregular verb, and when that goes up, it's got its ending there. Okay. Now, when you do this day after day after day, I don't do it forever, but I might do it for a month or so. They start to anticipate what the ending is going to be before you reveal it, and that is very, very helpful when they can be a little bit ahead of you in that way. So things like faire, on a fait des gestes or something, or apprendre, on a appris, whatever it might be. Very, very useful indeed. And that's been a good addition to the lesson. Once it's up and running and it's taken root, then instead of using d'abord, ensuite, finalement, I'll use pour commencer, après, and then pour finir. So I use those, okay? And then after that's been going a little while, I might change those. And instead of using d'abord, ensuite, finalement, and pour commencer, après, and pour finir, I might use en premier lieu, en deuxième lieu, en troisième lieu. So different things you can use to bring the changes there. So any of those expressions really, really useful for the lesson menu. Okay. So last little bit then, these are what I referred to as bubble cards, okay? There we are. So I'll use this in my team competition. Nos da un punto, por favor. So whereas in French I would use est-ce que je peux avoir un point, or est-ce que nous pouvons avoir un point? Of course, in Spanish that doesn't really work, does it? Puedo tener un punto. It's much more authentic to say, will you give me, or will you give us a point? Nos da un punto, por favor. Me da un punto, por favor. That's really useful as well because it shows the bits that change. So these are bubble cards, and I have quite a lot of these. I mean, we're talking sort of 40, 50 cards that are quite easily grouped. And I've tried all sorts of different things in the past where I've stuck them to the edge of the table at the teacher's desk. And so I can just grab it. And I did this when it was OHTs with the old OHPs. You can just grab it and slap it straight on the OHP. And now, grabbing a piece of paper, sticking it under the visualizer. And that's okay. But I found I tended to knock them off. But that's one thing you could do. You could have a lever arch file with numbered dividers. And you very quickly get used to which number is which and go straight to it. But I find it a little slow. So what I prefer to do, and I've been doing this way for about 6, 7 years now, I have all of these cards on the floor at the front of the room under the screen or under the whiteboard. But they're not randomly there. They're all in groups. So I might have all of my team competition ones together, overlapping a bit like this so that I can see them easily. It's no good having them stacked up and squared up because you'd be flicking through trying to find them. But and I look for the symbol rather than look for the text because it is much quicker to spot it on the floor. So I'll have all my team competition ones together, all my est-ce que je peux ones together, all of my negatives together. No sé, no me acuerdo. I might have all of my correction ones together. Pronunciation ones together, and so on and so on. So I'm just very quickly just going to show you some of the ones I've got for the team competition, just to give you an idea. But if you'd like copies of any of these, you'll find them on my blog. This is Classroom Language Visuals, and they're all there. You can just download them and use them. I always photocopy them onto cards. I never laminate them, mainly because if the sun comes in sometimes, and the sun is shining on a laminated card, you can't read it. So, and I just reprint them once a year or something. So, and they're just blue tacked. So, nos da un punto, me da un punto, nos toca a nosotros, or os toca a vosotros. It's your turn to answer the question. And at the end of the lesson, Grupo 1, ¿cuántos puntos tenéis? We ask them how many points they've got. Tenemos, in French, this is great. Combien de points avez-vous? Nous en avons 12. Okay, they could answer with nous avons 12 points, but nous en avons 12 is a great opportunity to teach that the use of en with numerals, isn't it? So we've had ¿cuántos puntos tenéis? Rob, ¿cuántos puntos tienes? And this is at a stage in the routine where they'll get individual points as part of a team. Tengo. And they get used to the fact that if they hear this question with tienes, I'm going to come back with tengo. If they hear it with tenéis, I'm going to come back with tenemos. No tengo ninguno, or je n'ai aucun point. Empatamos, ganamos nosotros, o perdemos nosotros at the end of the game. But during the game, at some stage in the lateness routine, I might want to introduce this sort of thing. De momento estamos ganando, pero eso puede cambiar. O de momento estamos perdiendo, pero vamos a ganar. Yeah. At the beginning of a lesson, I can sort of not quite remember very well who won last time. So, ¿quién ganó la última vez? En la última clase ganó el grupo 2. O en la última clase ganamos nosotros, o ganaron ellos. And the same for losing. Pero hoy vamos a ganar nosotros y vais a perder vosotros. And these would get stuck on the wall. I wouldn't use them under the visualizer. So that just gives you an idea of how these can be used on the fly. I have them all on the floor behind me, and they get stuck on the wall in the moment, at the moment that it's needed. And then at the end of the lesson, down they come, ready for the next class. And when I know from my grid that I've used these with all of the classes and they've taken root, then I can leave them on the wall and there they stay, usually on another wall so that there's room for new things on the front wall. Well, we've covered ever such a lot of ground today. I hope it's been useful to you. Please do get in touch with your questions, and I'll probably answer most of them, I think, on the blog, because that will be a way of everyone getting to see the answers, and there'll be other people who'll find this interesting as well. But do stay in touch. I'm on Twitter. There's the blog, jamesstubbs.wordpress.com, and you have my email addresses as well. So all the best for your teaching, and thank you for staying to the end of this.